Hi everyone and welcome to the Empowered You podcast. I'm Chavi Israel, your host, speaking to you from Sydney, Australia. After October 7, I found myself in uncomfortable situations, not sure how to respond or navigate. That's why I created the Empowered You, first an organization and now a podcast to equip you with the knowledge, skills, and tools surrounding Israel and your Jewish identity. In each episode, we'll explore various topics from multiple perspectives so that you can feel informed, empowered, and proud of who you are. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Hello, Rabbi Freedman.
Good afternoon, Javi. Nice to be here.
I know.
And nice to have you here in our shul.
It's such a beautiful shul, Central Synagogue.
Thank you.
It actually has a bit of a history, doesn't it?
Yes, well, it's quite old, but this particular shul, the new one, came as a result of a tragedy, which was an electrical fire that took the whole shul out. But it was rebuilt to the most magnificent standard, and it's really one of the great edifices of Sydney Jewry. It's a treasure.
Yeah, it is a treasure. And I'm not originally from Sydney, but we're now in this new room that I never even knew existed. So I guess it's...
Well, this is one of the libraries. We've got actually 3 libraries now. It's funny you say that, because for many years, I've worked here since 2009. And for years, I would turn a corner or find a door and I'd say to somebody, what's that? What's in there? And I'd find all these little places that I never knew existed. So yeah, it's quite a big building. We seat all together in the shul, up and down, about 2,000 people. But the main thing is when people come from the States, where you would imagine they've seen fabulous shuls, their eyes fall out of their head when they see this shul. So it really is something special in terms of the architecture, the whole ambiance, and it's not full every Shabbos, but last Shabbos, as it happens, we must have had about between 600-700 people here.
Wow.
We had 2 ufrufs, we had a bar mitzvah, and on Leil Shabbat we had a bat mitzvah, so full of simcha.
Amazing, and it should only be used for simchas and good things.
Indeed.
So, Rabbi Freedman, I can hear that you are not from Australia originally. So can you tell us a little bit about your childhood? Where were you raised?
Yeah, I was born in London. My parents were from also Britain. My father, Oliver Sholem, was a first-generation English person. His parents came from Warsaw around about 1911. We can't be 100% sure. They had 1 child already, and then 3 more were born during the decade of what we'd call the decade of World War I. And my father was born right in the middle of World War I, 1916, so his parents called him Shulam. He was called up during World War II, and he fought in a crack regiment, Scottish regiment. They never saw action, thankfully, but they were placed on the outer northern islands, reaches of the United Kingdom, to stop the German Navy landing on those islands. And people may have heard of them. They're quite famous now for oil, called the Shetland Islands. And during his time off, he would go to one of the nearest Jewish communities to, I guess, meet the girls and have a bit of a social life. And from the Shetland Islands, actually in the Arctic Circle. So interesting, you had to ask questions about Shabbos, when Shabbos begin and end, because in the winter it doesn't get light, and in the summer it doesn't get dark. So he was told to go by the nearest Jewish community, which was Aberdeen. But in terms of sort of a vibrant Jewish community at that time, just south of the border of Scotland and England is a town called Newcastle. And that's where my mum came from. She was born there. Her mum was born in London, and her parents were actually buried in Newcastle. They came from Eastern Europe. And my mum's dad, who I never knew, his name was Davy, hence my name, David. He was also born in the northeast of England. And that's where they lived. So my dad met my mum when he was on leave. and then they married in 1942 in the middle of the war.
Wow.
And they didn't have children till the war ended. I don't know whether that was by chance or deliberate. I never discussed it with them. So I have one brother who's 3.5 years older than me, born in 1946, but he was born in that part of the world, in the northeast, because my dad had not yet been demobbed from the army, and so he wasn't working. So my mum was still living with her parents, although she did spend some time in the Shetland Islands with my dad and helped make like Pesach and Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur for the Jewish boys in what was called the Gordon Highlanders. Anyway, they then moved to London, where my dad came from, and I was born in 1949. So I had a great upbringing. I had loving parents. My dad ran his own business in textiles, in reclamation, and I went to a school south of the River Thames. Most people who think of London and the Jewish community think of north of the Thames. So places like Edgware, Golders Green, of course, Hendon, etc. But we were from south of the Thames. The Royal Borough makes it sound very posh. Royal Borough of Kingston upon Thames was in one direction, and where they ran the Epsom Derby, which the Queen used to go to every single year. So at the end of our road, we used to sort of wave to the Queen as she drove past. She loved the horses, was Epsom. And that's where I was brought up. But the school I went to, I was the only Jewish person in the school for many years. Later, I went to another school, and there were about 10 of us. So it wasn't.
So you went to public school, I'm assuming.
I went to state schools.
Yeah.
And again, we talk about what people are going through now. I always call that the second Elizabethan age. And of course, after the Shoah and after World War II, there was no anti-Semitism. There was no room for it in the Western world after everything the Jews had been through. So in fact, I was sort of quite a star in a way within the school. And of course, I didn't go to the daily prayers. I didn't participate in religious instruction. And the staff there who weren't Jewish knew that obviously that I was Jewish, and they used to ask me to give talks even when I was 11 and 12 to 15, 16-year-old kids about what it meant to be Jewish. But just to illustrate, and again, very few people realize this, there's only 15 million Jews in the world. Currently, there were less at that time after the war. And so the majority of people in a place like Britain never met a Jew. If you happen to live in London, you might have met a Jewish person. But if you live in some of the provincial or out west, and one of the teachers we had, I was 11 years old, and she would have probably been about 21. And she came from Cornwall, which is the far, far west of England. And she took the register on the very first day she came in. And then she said, "Can you bring out your 5 shillings for your dinner money?" Because every day the school laid on for 1 shilling a day, a lunch, a dinner they called it dinner for the kids. And obviously I didn't have school dinners. I actually lived about 15 minutes away, and I just used to walk home or run home. My mum didn't work, so my mum generally was there, made me a bit of lunch. I went back to school. But nearly all the kids had school dinners. So when she called my name out, and I said, "I don't do school dinners," and she said to me, "Why not?" And I said, straight away, "Because I'm Jewish and I can't eat that food." And she stopped and she started to stare at me. And she looked me up and down, and her head went from side to side. And she goes, "Are you really Jewish?" And I said, "Sure." And she goes, "Because I can't see any horns." And she'd been told by her father, who was a minister of religion in Cornwall, that Jewish people had horns coming out of their head. Now, she wasn't being anti-Semitic.
No.
On the contrary, she really loved us as a group, and we liked her. I remember her very well. But that was her education, that Jewish people had horns. So that was the kind of world that we lived in. But being Jewish in England, you sort of were as English as the English, and all the things that your friends like, you liked. So if they like football, you like football. You like cricket, that everybody played cricket together. And it was, and other than that, went to shul every Shabbos, and obviously we had cheder.
So was your family observant?
Very traditional, but my dad actually worked. He had a business, and he did work on Shabbos mornings in the business until he didn't need to, and then he stopped. But even when he worked, my mum took us to shul every single Shabbos. There wasn't a Shabbos that we weren't there. So I suppose, and again, in terms of English Jews at the time, I'd say the overwhelming majority kept kosher. So the Rav would come to my house. My mum made sure we had private lessons as well. So the Rav of the Kehillah would come, and he was very happy to eat, a cake that my mum had made. Everything was fully kosher. And a lot of English Jews were like that. When I came to Australia, of course, it was quite many decades on, and maybe things had changed in England as well. But I don't think that was so true of Australian Jewry. You either were from or you weren't from, and if you weren't from, you didn't keep kosher either. But a lot of English Jews kept kosher, even if they would drive to shul or get a bus to shul or whatever it might be.
It reminds me of South African Jewry, because I know that South African Jewry are quite traditional in the way of they have a kosher home 100%, and they will go to shul on Shabbos, but they might drive to shul and they might work. So I am getting similar vibes from South African Jewry and English Jewry somewhat.
Yeah, I think probably the main difference from my experience, because I served here in Australia a community that was about 90% expat South African. And from what I learned from them was that they were very regular at going to shul on Friday night, on Leil Shabbos, but not so much on Shabbos morning. Whereas, you go in those days, certainly on a Friday night in a shul in England, you'd get a dozen men, obviously you get a minyan, but on Shabbos morning, the shul would be full. You could have hundreds of people there.
I know we've established that the majority of the Jewish community lived in centre London. It's called,
not so much central London. They lived in northwest London and northeast London.
My mother's from Stamford Hill, by the way. I don't know if that's northwest or northeast.
So what happened was the Jews, when they came in from the shtetl, when they came from Poland and Russia, they settled in the East End, which is still true of immigrant communities coming in. They had the Bangladeshi community after us, and so on and so forth. And then as they got a little more affluent, they could move out. And moving due north from the East End of London, you would come to places like Stamford Hill, Tottenham. Hence, Spurs became a big football team for Jewish people. I follow football, but I don't follow Spurs because my mum was from Newcastle, and all our holidays are up there with my gran and with my uncle and with all the mishpacha. So I follow Newcastle United, and that's my team. But a lot of Jewish people followed Spurs, and to this day they're still nicknamed the Yids. But they moved out of the East End. Those that then did well again moved a little bit further north to Ilford. And when I lived in England, the largest Jewish community in London was in Ilford, in the Redbridge area. But some moved not due north, but what we call northwest. And then they went through places like Brondesbury, Willesden, Dollis Hill, and then a bit further to Golders Green. And Golders Green became, like Stamford Hill, very frum, and also parts of Golders Green very frum. But the United Synagogue, that was sort of more centrist, they, we didn't use the term like modern Orthodox in those days. They would be members of the United Synagogue, and it didn't really make a difference where they lived, but the main shuls were St. John's Wood, which was a little bit closer to the West End, and then up north to Golders Green and around, called the North Circular, or as we famously called it, the Bible Belt. And you then would go round Hendon, Edgware, and then you'd have my shul, which was Belmont, and then further round again to the West, Pinner. So you had a whole stream of shuls, and then even during my time, and certainly after I left England in '88, shuls on the next, if you like, concentric circle.
Gotcha.
So people like Bushy and Boreham Wood and Elstree.
It's spread. But my question is, you were the only Jewish kid in your state school.
Yeah.
So then where you lived specifically, the Jewish community was smaller,
much smaller
than, let's say, compared to Stamford Hill, for example. So,
Yeah,
because you were the only Jewish kid in your
yeah,
whole
we
school.
never felt deprived. I had a very Jewish upbringing. I never went to school on Yom Tov. If Shabbos came in, Shabbos comes in London in the middle of the winter at 3:45, 3:45. So I would just take a note to school at the beginning of that season, and I would simply hand it in, and then I'd be leaving home at 3:00. I'd be leaving school at 3:00, be home, be ready for Shabbos.
Yeah.
So there, nothing was a problem. I mean, you got the odd teacher that didn't quite get it. I had a PE teacher once, and it was the first year. I was about 11, and we had games, and it was like one whole afternoon, and it was a Monday afternoon, and just that year, first year in at that high school, Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot,
And
Shmini
all the
Atzeret was a
festivals.
Monday. It was Monday, Tuesday, and Yom Kippur obviously on the Wednesday. So in the first month at school, I only saw him once, and he only saw me once. So after about a month, he's going round and he says, "Who are you?" I told him who I was. He used to go by the surname. I'm Freedman. He goes, "Where have you been?" I said, "I'm Jewish. I've been having Jewish holidays." And I don't think he was very impressed. But I wouldn't call it anti-Semitic. The guy was just some teachers are a bit sadistic and power mad, and he was a bit like that. But I didn't really ever face. The only time anybody ever said anything to me which you could call anti-Semitic was my very best friend in junior school, who called me a Jew boy, and I must say I hit him. It's the only time I've ever hit anyone, and I hit him in the solar plexus. And I look back now and I think, why did I hit him? So he called me a Jew boy. I mean, why was I offended? It wasn't like that I was.
And he was your best friend, you said?
Yeah. So obviously I did something, or it was the only time he ever did it. And he called me a Jew boy, and I hit him, and he doubled over in pain. He never did it again. But I look back now and think, that's an odd thing for me to do, to hit somebody. Why did I even think it was such a terrible thing? I wasn't brought up with anti-Semitism. It wasn't like I had a rough upbringing with people screaming things at me.
Yeah.
It was the one and only time, and that was my reaction. So there was obviously something inside me.
Intergenerational trauma.
Yeah, well, I don't have.
Something.
I mean, we talk about Holocaust surviving
But even,
children, and I haven't got that.
No, but just being a Jew, I'm very blessed that none of my great-grandparents went through the Shoah. They all have their own stories of they managed to escape. One of my great-grandfathers, Ephraim Karlbach, was actually in England during the war. But I still feel the Jewish intergenerational trauma too. I mean, I don't know. I feel like it's like just we have this collective memory as a people.
I think in the end, it's the more you learn, particularly history. I love history.
Yeah.
And the more you read, and I suppose by then I would have been about 11, 10 or 11. And by that time I was beginning to learn and understand who I was. I mean, the interesting thing for people listening is that at that age, we knew absolutely nothing about the Shoah. My grandparents, who came from Warsaw, my Zayda died when I was 11. I never had a conversation with him. He spoke Yiddish. I spoke English. Of course, my dad spoke Yiddish, but he never spoke Yiddish at home because my mum only spoke English. So that was sad. So I never got the opportunity to ask him any questions.
Yeah.
And my Bubba, I don't know, she would sit in a chair for years and go, "Oy vez mia." And I look back now and think, was she going "Oy vez mia" of all the family and friends who didn't make it?
Yeah.
But at the time, we went to Cheder and we learned about the Shemona Esrei, we learned about Rabbi Akiva, we learned how to daven, but the Shoah just wasn't on the radar at all. And what really, I think, one of the first things that changed me and made me more Jewish, or more having a sense of urgency to find out who I really was, that I wasn't English, that when they talk in school about the Crusades, these people who were being portrayed as heroes by Hollywood, these were the people that were murdering our ancestors. And when I was learning in school about Henry VIII and his number of wives, my people were probably somewhere either still in Franco-Germany or more likely in Poland. And I began to have this feeling, well, this is not me. I got to find out really, who I am. And I think one of the first things that happened was around about 1961, when Adolf Eichmann went on trial, when he was kidnapped. And if people like yourself, you weren't alive, you wouldn't understand. The BBC, I'll just give you an example, they never spoke about it. Suddenly, we'd have a program like, there was only one channel. My mum and dad had a little box television set, black and white, and whatever was on, that's what we watched, because there was one channel, BBC. And they would have a program, This Is Your Life. And it could be people who'd done great things during World War II. It could be maybe a singer or a sports person. It certainly wouldn't be anything of any deep interest. This was light entertainment. And then along comes the show, the Adolf Eichmann's trial. And the BBC sort of woke up and thought, well, we better explain to people what happened. And I remember watching a program about Warsaw and the Warsaw Ghetto. And it was kind of a program of trying to introduce the Holocaust to the British public, what really went on behind the scenes. Because obviously you can understand after the war, the British were just so thrilled that they defeated the Nazis, but it was about the Battle of Britain. It was about the victory at sea over the U-boats. It was about D-Day. It was about Churchill. It wasn't about the Jews. They knew that something had happened, but it wasn't like full front and center. And I remember watching that program, and it impacted me in terms of, well, how should I now feel? I can't forget. Should I forgive? Have I a right to forgive? I wasn't sophisticated enough to be able to ask those questions in that way. Who are we to forgive? The people that they did this to, they either survived or most of them didn't survive. They're the ones who can forgive or not. Who are we to forgive? But at the same time, you felt that you were sort of a custodian of their legacy. And so that was the first thing, 61, 62, 63. And times were changing anyway. The world was becoming less Victorian. It was in terms of English history. I think after World War One, things became very liberal for a while until the Great Depression. And anyway, World War One was just a precursor to World War Two. But after World War Two, things really changed, and Beatlemania, and Carnaby Street, and the change of fashion, the power of youth, and
the rise of feminism.
Oh, well, that was a bit
later on.
That was a bit later.
Yeah.
The pill had a lot to do with that as well. But definitely the times, as
were changing.
Bob Dylan wrote it, and read the lyrics. The times they were a changing, and so we were caught up in that as well. But there were like two streams here. There was this stream of moving away from a very narrow, traditional English, churchy type of, and we just happened to be Jewish, so we did the Jewish things and they did the Christian things. We were a minority, of course, but there were only two minorities in Britain when I grew up. I always say to people, and they smile, I say there were those people that the majority of English people didn't particularly like, and there were those, and then there was the larger minority who they absolutely hated. So those they didn't really like, they didn't really know, were the Jews. There were probably 500,000 Jews in Britain at the time, about 50 million population, and the quarter to 500,000 were Jews. Maybe about 250,000 in London, and another 250,000 spread through the rest of the country, particularly in Manchester, Glasgow, Birmingham, the city centres, Newcastle, Cardiff, etc. But then you had this other large group of people that they really detested, and they were called Roman Catholics. But again, to understand that, you've got to understand British history and all about the Reformation. So when, for example, I was at school and I stepped out of the assemblies, because they had prayers every morning, that was part of this the system there. There was no other Jews to stand and chat to, but there were Roman Catholics. So my best friends at school were the Roman Catholic boys.
Interesting, because you were both the minorities, so you kind of
And just to, again, to illustrate when I say they didn't really like us that much because we're different, but they really hated the Catholics. So I remember on one occasion, and again, it was a turning point in the history of post-war Europe in terms of Catholicism. Pope Pius XII was, look, the jury is still out. I've read books about him. It's not for me to condemn him, but one feels that he could have done more for the Jewish people generally, and then more particularly those in Italy, but certainly generally. I think if I can just summarize Pope Pius XII, he was too concerned about communism, and he didn't understand the dangers of Nazism and fascism, whereas Churchill was exactly lehefech. He was exactly the other way around. And unbelievably, he worked with Stalin because he understood that Nazism under Hitler was worse than anything that communism could bring. So just, like sort of a crossover. Yeah. Anyway, so I'm sitting, just to give you an example. So after he died in, I think, around about 58, the new Pope was a very saintly man who took the title Pope John the 23rd. And he understood what the Shoah had been. And I think he understood the responsibility of the church. And he started a movement within the church to try and right some of those wrongs. And although he died before it was complete, it was already happening. He died, I think, around about 63. But by about 65, it was called Nostra Aetate, came about. And one of the things that it said was that, which was revolutionary for the church, was that previously any Jew was guilty of killing Jesus. So here I was a 13, 14, 15-year-old boy, and I, in their eyes, was guilty of deicide. I'd killed God, their God, Jesus. And along comes this radical change within Catholicism to say that Jews alive now are not guilty of killing Jesus. Obviously, I mean, how can a boy of 15 be guilty of something that happened 2,000 years earlier? And I remember I walked into a maths lesson, and the teacher was a part-time preacher in the Anglican Church.
Yeah.
And he looked at me, and then he looked at my friend, whose name was Keith, who was Roman Catholic, and he addressed these words to him. And what he was saying, you have to understand, this was not an anti-Semitic comment. This was an anti-papal comment. He said, "What do you think of that idiot in Rome who thinks that Freedman is somehow guilty, or now saying he's no longer guilty?" Like, because he wasn't saying that I was. He was saying I was never guilty of killing Jesus. And here's the Pope in Rome trying to accommodate change, but which was, I think, to his credit, but he was trying to make the Pope look stupid for even considering that a Jew of 15 years of age could be considered by anybody guilty of a crime that took 2,000 years earlier. So basically what he's saying, he described the Pope as that idiot or that fool in Rome. And my friend, whose surname, funnily enough, was Friend, his name was Keith Friend, stood up right there and then in the middle of the maths lesson, and he walked out and he went home because his whole belief system and his religion had been insulted. I was just a pawn. I was simply being used by this maths teacher to attack a Roman Catholic.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But can you imagine now? The maths teacher would get sacked. The world has changed. But in those days, he could say it, and this boy wasn't going to complain about it, but he just stood up and walked out.
Wow. I could hear all these stories about your childhood, and I love hearing about the history of England. It's very fascinating for me also being Australian. But just moving forward,
Yeah.
How did you know, or when did you know that you wanted to become a rabbi?
So I'll tell you firstly, when we were about 4 or 5 years, when I was 4 or 5 years old, and I'm sure a lot of people will nod. they have children, and they love showing their children off, and they often say in front of aunts and uncles, little Yankel, little Mendy, little David, what are you going to do when you get older? So they used to ask me and my brother Michael. So Michael, say 3.5 years older than me, always answered, I'm going to be an archaeologist. And I always answered, I'm going to be a rabbi.
Oh, wow.
My brother turned out to be a very, very good accountant. And I turned out to be an average rabbi, but I became a rabbi anyway. So, but really it was just something that was a kind of myth. I said it. If you were to ask me, why did I say it? I don't know. I love being in shul. I love everything about the Yiddishkeit that my mum and my dad and my grandma gave me, but I can't really explain why I answered in that way. So I'd say that through the 60s, a couple of things happened that really sort of changed the direction of my life. I joined a Jewish youth organization called JYSG, Jewish Youth Study Groups. It wasn't anti-Zionist by any means. It was very pro-Israel, but it was not a B'nai Akiva. It wasn't a Habonim. It was not a Zionist organization. It was a Jewish study organization. And what we did was we had local groups in our own area. So ours was in Kingston. There was another one in West London, another one in Northwest London, in Golders Green. There was one or two in Manchester, some in Cardiff, some in Birmingham. And we used to get together, run our own programs, occasionally invite guest speakers, often Rabbonim from the area. And then we would have interfunctions, or we'd go to other people's groups. If we could, in London, you could get on the tube and cut across London. And of course, we had summer and winter camps, or summer and winter schools, as we called it, of which we had the most wonderful, wonderful teachers, Rabbonim, and we'd learn all morning. And in the afternoon, we could do what we like.
Was it co-ed?
It was co-ed. And in the evening, there were like activities that we put on. It was run by a couple called Harold and Hannah Levy of blessed memory. And there was a national VAD, a national committee of the youngsters themselves, but each individual group had its own local committee or VAD.
Gotcha.
And I got really involved in that. It's where I met so many of my friends. And in a way, it was almost like a training for Jewish leadership in Anglo Jewry and beyond. And so many of these people went on to become Rabbonim, teachers, head teachers, Jewish civil servants. They're active not only in Britain, but around in America. Some of them traveled, like myself, come to Australia. Many went on Aliyah and are very active in the Jewish world in Israel. So that, I think, was moving me. And it was filled with young people who we wouldn't know if they were from or not. But when we were together, that was how we lived. That was taken for granted. When it came to summer and winter schools, we had a shul. We set up our own minyan. The people organizing it, the shamashim, would contact if they knew anybody. You can daven. You're going to do shachris. You're going to do musaf. You do Rishon and Sheni of this week's Sedra. You do Rishon, Sheni, or Shlishi Revi of next week's Sedra. And of course, we davened every morning and every evening, benched after every meal. It was a frum movement, but it wasn't necessarily filled with frum people. But because those that were the diehards of that movement, if they went through it between the ages of 14 and 18, they may have gone in not so frum, but nearly all of them came out frum.
Yeah.
And that's where I met Ruth. She actually moved into our area anyway, but we began going out, and we began to have this vision of what our life. I mean, I never proposed to my wife. She never proposed to me. We just knew we were going to get married. So
how old were you when you started dating?
I would have been about 16. She would have been 15.
Wow.
And I'd say within 6 months to a year, we knew we were going to get married. We knew what we wanted to do with our life. And
being a rabbi was on the cards.
Yeah, no, it still wasn't on the cards. I think the second thing, at that stage, I was still thinking of going to Leeds University, where there was a degree in textiles, and I was going to go into the business with my dad.
The schmatter business.
Well, the schmatter business is like what you're wearing.
Yeah.
Or even what I'm wearing. My dad was in real schmatters. So if anybody listening would remember the British series, The Steptoe and Son, these were like rag and bone men. They go up and down the roads collecting all kinds of old stuff, paying a few coppers for it. My dad would buy stuff from them. He would sort the cotton from the wool, the rayon, man-made fibers from natural fibers. He put the wool into big botany bales, put them on lorries, transport them up the Great North Road to Yorkshire, about 6, 7, 8 hours up to the north of England, and they would be remade into brand new wool again. So my dad was the traditional middleman. He was a little bit lucky. He had a bit of bad luck. His cousin stole everything from him. He was in partnership with his cousin, and he gannafed everything. I would have been about 4 or 5, but he decided to keep going. He borrowed a bit of money from family, and he managed to keep going. And then, I learned a lot from my dad, lots of things, and sort of in terms of you. Like I said to you once, I think things can be bad, but they're not that bad. And things can be good, but don't get too ahead of yourself because you never know what's around the corner. So this sort of bit of bad mazel happened to my dad. And then my dad had an appointment to see a man called Mr. Waller. He was a kind of Germanic guy, which was unusual in the 50s. And he turned out to be a German Jew. And he had the contract with the British government. You have to understand, there were hundreds of thousands of British men being demobbed, and everyone that came out of the army gave back their army uniform and got instead a demobbed suit. So the British government
needed someone to make all the suits.
No, not to make the suits, to get rid of the ones that they were taking back.
Gotcha, yeah.
So my dad had the contract, if you like, with the government to take these, sort them, bale them, transport them, sell them on. And that's
I get it. So then how did you, so you were going to go into that, but then
So I was going to go into that, but study groups were certainly moving me in that direction. And then something happened that I think changed the lives, I would say, of nearly every single Jew, particularly every young Jew who was alive at the time. And that's simply put, the 6-Day War. And I think, especially by then, I was reading a lot of Jewish history, and suddenly Jewish history, this wasn't history, this was almost biblical, historical, but right in front of your eyes. And I can't even begin to describe the lead up to it and then the week itself. I do remember, just to give you an illustration, I was still at school, I was 17, and a friend of mine, his name was Bernard, and he came up to me. I was walking into school with him on the Friday afternoon before the war started. Of course, we didn't know we knew something was going to happen.
Yeah.
We didn't know how, we didn't know what, and we certainly didn't know when. And he turned around to me and said an amazing thing. He said, "David, I just want to say to you how sorry I am that you're going to lose your country." Now, that was a really unusual thing to say to me, because, first of all, why did he feel that was my country? I was born in England. I'd lived my entire life in England. My parents would not fly after the war. My dad would never fly again. So we went to Wales, and we went to the West Country, and we went to Scotland for our holidays. But we never went to Israel. I'd never been to Israel. And yet here's this boy saying to me, "You're going to lose your country." And I don't know, there was this feeling. If you read Rabbi Sacks's writings about that time, he also, it was like a revelation to him. Why am I feeling this way?
Yeah.
He had the same feelings when I've read some of his books about that period. It was, could it happen again, that the Jews were going to be driven into the sea? And what's it got to do with me? Because it definitely had something to do with me. I remember, again, just as a a throwback. Nowadays, if you want to know something, you pick up your iPhone, pick up your computer, or you go on your TV, and you've got 24 hours news cycle. So what we had then, we had, first of all, there was no television at night after 11 o'clock. So that's it. They played the national anthem and everybody went to bed. During the day, they had a 6 o'clock news on the radio, BBC, and they had a 6 o'clock news or 6:30 on the television. And that was the only news broadcast. You might have one more news broadcast around about 10 o'clock with the fishing forecast on the radio. And that was it. And I remember I used to come in from school at about 4:30, and my mum and dad would have delivered the evening newspaper. It was called the Evening Standard. So as soon as it arrived, it would come through the door, and I'd run and get it. And my mum was in, so we'd be having the radio on and trying to pick up any news. And I'd read and see what's happened. And then that was 4:30. Now, at 5:30, there was another version of the Evening Standard, which brought the final racing results. And the nearest newsagent was, for me, I ran a lot. So for me, a 5-minute run, I could get to that newsagent. So I'd run round at 5:30 and buy another newspaper in case there was like one paragraph that wasn't in the earlier one about what's going on in Israel. And then at 6:30, they published the final one, which was the stock exchange results. But once again, it was 2 hours later than the one we had at home, and there may be something different. So I'd go round again. And you did that every night. And I remember on the Monday, the war broke out on the Monday. On the Monday night, Michael Elkins, who was an American Voice, Jewish, the BBC correspondent in Jerusalem, and he said that the Israeli Air Force had wiped out the Egyptian Air Force. But the BBC correspondent in Egypt, in Cairo, said that the Egyptian Air Force that morning had wiped out the Israeli Air Force. And we didn't know for 2 days what was the truth. Wow. Now we take it for granted. The Israelis had this amazing plan and they did it. So I think the almost an event of biblical proportions, and we know how it affected Israel and the religious people within Israel.
Yes.
And Rav Kook, et cetera, or the descendants. And
I'm reading that book, Yossi Klein Halevi's book about the paratroopers.
Right.
So yeah.
No, look, it definitely changed lives. Look, on the other hand, when I eventually got to Israel for the first time after we were married, my wife and I went for a belated honeymoon. I remember saying to an Israeli about almost like, this is like from Min HaShomayim. And he said, "Oh, that's absolute nonsense." He said, we were always going to have this result. We had the better aeroplanes. We had the better guns. We had the better tanks. It just, that was the way he viewed it.
Well, that's his perspective. It's interesting. Obviously, October the 7th, it's something that we did not want one bit at all. And it's a tragedy for us, and we're still suffering. But that feeling that you probably felt, your soul was ignited somewhat, because you were saying about becoming a rabbi.
I think, first of all, it was a victory. I think October 7th is completely different.
No, but what I'm trying to say, it is completely different. But something, if you could say, I don't want to say the word positive. Suddenly, I feel like Jewish people across the globe, their souls have been ignited in the way of they know who they are and what they stand for. And Jewish people who were super disconnected to Judaism and to Israel are no longer in that specific way.
I think in that way you're right.
It has, because
it united the Jewish people, and it gave us a sense of pride in who we were, and certainly it's been, if you say what's been my the thrust of my rabbonis through the years, certainly in the way I speak, whether I speak to a bar mitzvah or speak to a couple, it's to feel extremely privileged that we are Jewish. Yes, there's been prejudice, there's been persecution, but put that to one side. What we have contributed to the world and what we continue to contribute to the world, that we are just lucky, or we're blessed to be born Jewish.
100%. we're living through history right now. I've always felt deeply connected to Israel. I grew up Chabad, but my mom's always been a Zionist, and I've always felt this longing and love for my land. But I feel like October the 7th, it suddenly, everything about me, I mean, I was always a proud Jew, but I became an even prouder Jew in so many ways. I also became more self-conscious of my Jewish identity, which is what triggered me to start the Empowered Jew, and at times uncomfortable about my Jewish identity, but also this real fire within me where I had a few non-Jewish friends who didn't necessarily support Israel, and I was like, I can't have anything to do with you kind of thing. Because for me, I am Israel. I am me and my people, we're one and the same.
Well, certainly it affected us, and then I really just I discarded the idea of going into a regular business world, and I decided to follow my Rav, Rabbi Eddie Jackson, who had taught me. He taught me privately, like in the Bagrut in England, you do O levels, you do A levels, and I did O level classical Hebrew. I did A level classical Hebrew just with him, once a week with him. And he went to Jews College, and I thought, well, I'll go to Jews College. The options at that age, as 18, 19, for me would have been to go to Gateshead, and that was not my hashkafa. So if I was going to stay in England, I would go to Jews College.
It's called Jews College?
It was part of London University. It was called JEWS, Jews College.
Oh, wow, cool.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. And I did a Semitics degree. The principal was Rabbi Dr. Zimmels, Zichrono Livracha. I remember they interviewed me. He interviewed me with the chief rabbi, Jacobovitz, and probably the president of the college. They didn't have many students. I mean, there weren't many people looking to become rabbonim in London. And of course, at that stage, the yeshiva, the whole yeshiva system in Israel was just really beginning. So my Rav, to his credit, said to me, I went to Jews College, but you'll be better off if you go to Israel and go and study there, whether it be like, I don't know, Dvar Yerushalayim in those days. I'm not sure when Gush was going. One of my kids went to Gush, one of my other kids went to Provenders. Not sure what was happening in 1968, 69. But I was with Ruth, and we weren't obviously living together, but I felt if I go off and leave her behind, I'll come back a different person. I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to
go through the journey together.
Yep. So I stayed in London, and I did my Semitics degree, and then as that came to an end, I got a call from the head office of the United Synagogue. They were going to put me in a position over in the east side of London, and because that's the way it worked, they put you in a small community, probably part-time, so you'd have to do some teaching and whatever. But my rabbi, Eddie Jackson, he by then had become the rabbi of quite a large congregation in the north called Kenton. And next to it was this small but burgeoning community, Belmont. And he was having quiet words with the Gaboim of that community. And he rang me up and he said, look, I've got a job for you, but give these people a ring tonight. So I rang them and we made a meeting. And then Ruth and I got in the car and we drove up to see if it was a nice area. We thought we could bring up children. We were married by then. We married while we were both still at university. Ruth did a business degree, and we liked the area, and I got the job. So.
And is this where you met Menachem Begin? I want to hear about that.
So yeah, well, it's interesting when you're in the rabbinical world, you end up meeting interesting people. Sometimes you don't realize how amazing or interesting they are. So, because of my work, I met members of the royal family. I met Princess Margaret. Coincidentally, I met Princess Diana. Actually once bumped into the Queen, really almost bumped into her. And I wanted to tell her I was saying the bracha. I also wanted to tell her that I named there's a tradition, when Alexander, all the boys that year were named Alexander.
Yeah.
And she had her silver jubilee in 1977. and our second child was being born. She was born actually Erev Rosh Hashanah, literally Erev Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah.
And we called her Sarah, and I also called her Elisheva. And I called Elisheva because of the Queen, because the Queen had been although she'd never been to Israel, that's another whole story about the Foreign Office, and they're so pro-Arab. But she herself had been, I think, good for the Jews, and it was just a sign of respect. And when I eventually met the Queen, I never had the chance to actually have you can't just go up and start talking. But I was really wanted to say to her, Mom, just so you know, one of our children is named after you out of respect for what you've done for the Jewish people and made us feel so warm and welcome in this country. So I met probably the greatest man I ever met is a man that subsequently, after he died, saved my life. And he may well have saved people in your family, their lives as well. His name was Ernst Chain. He was a German Jewish refugee, came to England, I think, in the 1930s, went to Cambridge, and he worked with an Australian called Florey and a Scottish man called Fleming. And between the three of them, they discovered antibiotics. And I remember a few years ago, I would have been in my upper 60s, and I had terrible bronchial cough. And I have a very good friend who now lives in Yerushalayim, who's a GP. And rather than go to my own GP, he was living in the next street. So I said to him, Bob, do me a favor, can you just come and see me? And he said, you need antibiotics. And within 24 hours, 48 hours, I was almost 100% better. And I said to him, Bob, do you think, go back 100 years, 70 years before antibiotics, man of my age, get something like this, maybe it becomes in the end pneumonia or something, I could have died, yeah? And he goes, sure, that's what people used to die from. That's why people died. And I met Ernst Chain, had to give a vote of thanks to him. So just in terms of what one man, albeit with two other men, what they achieved and the millions and millions of lives that they saved, I don't think I can put anybody next to him. If I put anybody next to him, I would have put Winston Churchill next to him.
Oh, you met Winston?
I never met Winston. Yeah. But we all had the day off when he died, and we all watched it on television. But subsequently, when I've read many books, he was truly a gift. He was a gift from heaven. Without him, I don't think Britain would have stood up to the Nazis. And Lord knows what would have happened, number one, to the Jews of Britain, number two, to the Jews of the Yishuv. And then eventually, who knows what would have happened with America. Yeah. Churchill was one, not in a million, but one in a billion. But then...
But it's interesting about Churchill. I know in 1948, Israel declared its independence finally, but when you learn about the way that the British dealt with, the Jewish people living in Israel and the Commission of Inquiry, and then they limited
the white paper.
The white paper.
But in 1945, when war ended, there was a general election in Britain, and he lost power.
Yeah,
the Labour Party came in, and the worst of them was the Foreign Secretary called Ernest Bevin. I'm not going to call him an anti-Semite, but he hated the concept of Israel. And again, part of the problem was that Menachem Begin was an incredible man, and he understood from the moment that he landed in Palestine, as it was, I think around about 41 or 42, can't be sure, but around about 41 or 42, he came on a kind of circuitous route because, escaped from Poland. I think he went through Siberia or something, but eventually he got there. And I remember a story being told that there were some of the chalutzim, and they went into this coffee place for a drink, and then they came out afterwards, and they said, one of them said, who's that guy in there who says that the only way that we can have a country of our own is to attack the British, get rid of the British. And one guy said, he's new here. He's a new guy, just arrived from Poland. His name's Menachem Begin.
Well, he was kind of right.
He was absolutely right. That led to the withdrawal of Britain from the mandate, and then passing it on to the United Nations, and then the rest is history.
But even like the book, The Exodus, where a whole bunch of Holocaust survivors, thousands of Holocaust survivors, finally came to the shores of Haifa and were sent right back to Europe.
Of course. But
anyway,
so Begin, when he eventually became prime minister of Israel, he came to England. But look, the British establishment traditionally have been very, other than Churchill. Churchill's an interesting case.
He was the exception.
He was absolutely the exception through the 1930s. He stood against everything that Hitler stood for. He stood against fascism. He saw through it. He knew what it was. One of his more recent biographers, the original biographer was, the official biographer was Martin Gilbert, who was Jewish. I met Martin Gilbert once.
Wow, that's amazing.
But his later biographer, around about 6, 7, 8 years ago, produced a phenomenal work of over 2,000 pages on his whole life called Andrew Roberts. And he was asked once, it was a great question. He was interviewed about Churchill for 2 hours. And at the very end, these two young men said, "Thank you so much, Andrew, for your time. But we need to ask you one more question. Is there any question that we should have asked you about Churchill that we didn't ask you?" So Andrew Roberts said, "That's a very good question. And there is one. And it's perturbed me." I mean, this is a guy that knows more about Churchill than anyone. And he said, "Why? Why did Churchill stand alone?" The aristocracy in England were pretty anti-Semitic, didn't hold anything for the Jews. People like Lord Halifax, they wanted to make some kind of arrangement with Hitler so they could protect the British Empire. And Churchill just kept saying, no, they had what's called the wilderness years. And in the end, he became prime minister. And Andrew Roberts said 3 reasons. He thinks, he doesn't know the answer. He said, these are my 3 reasons. And in reverse order, the third was because he was a soldier. And being a soldier, he understood what warfare was. He understood what the risks were. He understood what would happen if you wouldn't fight, and the principle of fighting for something more important. So he said, number 1, he was a soldier. Number 2, he said, because he was a historian. And he did. He was a fine historian. And he wrote books not only about his own family, but other events. And then afterwards, he wrote books on the Second World War. And as he said, as a historian, you see history in perspective, and you see cause and effect. You see the world in a different way. So he said, as a historian, perhaps he saw, what had happened in World War I, what could happen. He said, but in his opinion, the main reason why he stood against Hitler, because unlike nearly all the others, Churchill was philo-Semitic. He liked Jewish people. He respected Jewish people. He had wonderful Jewish friends in Britain, as well as particularly in the United States of America. And he saw that if a man like Hitler, and his main argument was get rid of the Jews in one way or other. He wasn't talking at that stage about genocide, but certainly persecuting the Jews. Somebody stands for that. This person in Churchill's eyes has to be removed. So it was a phenomenal thing.
That's very fascinating.
But anyway, so Churchill wasn't in charge of the government at the time of the formation of the State of Israel, and in those years just before, that was the Labour Party.
But going back to Menachem Begin,
so Begin came through, and the people really, the aristocracy, government people, particularly the Foreign Office people, they certainly didn't like him. I lived in a regular street in Stanmore. The guy next to me, when we moved in, I always remember, was wearing a cap. I'd never said a word to this guy. He was a new neighbor. And he came out as boxes were coming into our new house. And he didn't, so to speak, introduce himself. He didn't say, "Look, I'm Jack. What's your name?" He actually said to me, he goes, "Now, let me tell you, now they're Jews." And he pointed to a house opposite. And he goes, and that house there, they're Jews. So obviously he'd found out that I was Jewish. Whether he found out I was a rabbi, I had no idea. But he was already, and I thought, wow, this guy's a bit anti. And then, you get to know somebody across a garden fence. And it turned out, he'd tell me one day that the 2 British sergeants, you can look it all up in the history book, it's a terrible story, the 2 British sergeants that the Irgun hanged as a recrimination as a punishment for what they did to members of the Irgun, and that was Begin. They were two of his friends.
Oh, okay.
So he harbored this sort
resentment.
Yes, well, I would say even hatred, really, of Jews and maybe of Israel. Not that we didn't get on. I mean, across a garden fence, you get on. He was my immediate neighbour. But that was the introduction to it, and that's what I found out later. And that's the way the British people felt, in general terms, about Begin, because of the bombing of the King David Hotel, and that was the headquarters of the British Army, etc. But he didn't apologize for it, and I think that's what we of our generation loved. And as I think I told you once before when we were speaking, I was very lucky to be invited to the Royal Albert Hall, where it was a gathering of maybe, I don't know how many people it sits in there, 1,000, 2,000 maximum, and he was the guest speaker, and he spoke to the Jewish community. So you can imagine a lot of people would have wanted to be there and couldn't be there, but I was invited and I went. And it was a phenomenal experience, the way he spoke. And he said, that they don't like me. I should worry that they don't like me. He wasn't particularly about the British, but talking about European civilization. Look what they've done. They put my parents into a gas chamber. They killed 1 million Jewish children, he said. They will never take our children again as long as I am here and as long as Israel is here. 1 million Jewish children went and died because no one was there to protect them. That's why we're here, and that's what we will do. So he was completely unapologetic about the stand he was taking in those days. But in the end, the stronger you are, the more likely is you can make peace. And he was able to make peace with Sadat, which I think came after that event. But it was powerful, his oratory, certainly one of the great orators I've ever heard.
Wow.
And as I probably said to you, I mean, you end up, how old would I have been? 28? I would have been about 28. And then you suddenly realize that you're crying, as he's talking, because this is really powerful. This is why we have Israel, and we have Israel because of these great men. And obviously he and Ben-Gurion were on either side of a huge divide. They didn't like each other. They fought each other. Begin, in some respects, gave way to Ben-Gurion at an earlier stage in history. But Ben-Gurion was an amazing man, and Begin was an amazing man. Their politics were different, but as Jews, they were really determined to ensure that the Jewish people had a future. And I met David Ben-Gurion once. I never really belonged to B'nai Akiva, but we had a B'nai Akiva group in our shul. So I don't know how old I would have been, 9 or 10. And I just remember we all had to dress up in the B'nai Akiva, and we were like the
the welcoming committee?
Yeah, like these kids, and he walked past us. So I mean, he was like as far away from me as you are now. Incredible. And he walked past. All I remember was the hair. These huge tufts of white hair coming out from either side of his head, and So I suppose I look back on, as having met, in my opinion, the two greatest prime ministers that Israel's produced.
That's very unbelievable. When you shared that story with me about Menachem Begin, when you said, who am I to care what European civilization or the British, why should I care what they say when my brothers and sisters were being led to
Well, that's right. And he said it. He said it. It was a bit like Thatcher in that regard. Thatcher said what she meant, and she meant what she said. So I liked Thatcher, and Thatcher liked the Jewish community, and Chief Rabbi Jacobowitz was exceptionally close to her, and they supported each other. But the thing about Menachem Begin, he didn't care. He knew the British had done the wrong thing. He knew that there would have been maybe not millions, but even if we're talking about 10,000, maybe 100,000 Jews who might not have ended up in Auschwitz if the British would have said, we're going to open the borders of Israel or Palestine to the refugees. But they wouldn't do it because they're too worried about the Arabs.
So my question to you is, right now we're living in Australia in 2025, and we've had a few discussions already about this. Do you really feel like there's a future for Australian Jewry here in Australia? And even forget about Australian Jewry, Jews in the diaspora. Is there a future for Jews in the diaspora?
I think at the moment we are facing an attack on three sides. Previously, we only had an attack on one side, and we could somehow deal with it. So we have right-wing Nazis or neo-Nazis, and particularly in the post-war era, whether it was in Britain, whether it was in Australia, can't really talk too much about. I've never lived in America, and I don't really want. I'm not qualified to talk about the political system there. But certainly in terms of Britain and Australia, the neo-Nazis were always fringe. So you can see them coming and you can push them back. And they're small numbers and we can live with that. Obviously, if we can do away with it, even better, but we can live with it. Unfortunately, we've got a situation now in countries like Britain and Australia where we're being attacked on three sides. And it's going to be very difficult in the years ahead. So what are the three sides? We've still got the far right, and we've seen recently in Melbourne, the neo-Nazis on the street. They seem quite brazen. We've got the far left. You can call them the Greens, but they're also parts of the Labour Party, unquestionably. The Labour Party of today's Britain and the Labour Party of today's Australia is not the same Labour Party of Harold Wilson, Tony Blair, or Bob Hawke, or even Julia Gillard, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And we can see in the decision-making resolutions that they bring to their conferences, we can see, of course, with Penny Wong and Albanese, a whole track history from university days of radical pro-Palestinianism. I mean, the whole thing's a nonsense because, just I'm not here to explain history, but I wish I could have just a few hours. I need more than 1 hour with somebody like Penny Wong just to put her right, just to say to her, for example, in 1948, Yom Ha'atzmaut, what happened next? That's all I want to ask her. What happened next? How did it come about that Ben Gurion made a declaration? Because there were two populations living there. One was Jewish in hundreds of thousands, and one was Arab in greater numbers. And the UN had made the decision, and Ben Gurion said, right, we're going to have a country. What happened next? I'll tell you what happened next. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. Don't know if I've missed anybody out.
I think Yemen also joined a bit later on.
They all attacked. Who didn't attack? I've told you all the countries that attacked. Who didn't attack?
Israel.
Palestine.
Oh.
There is no Palestine.
There is no Palestine.
And there were no Palestinians. They were Arabs.
Yeah.
And 600,000 Jews had come from Arab countries.
She needs a major history lesson.
Anyway, so the second attack on us is from the left, who hold for the first time a non-Christian view of history. What do I mean non-Christian view of history? Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, at its base level, follows one posuk in the Torah. V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. We say it as Hillel said it, which I think is much stronger. Do not do to other people what you don't want other people to do to you. Bottom line, finish. But okay, they say Yoshki, Jesus came along and said, love your neighbor as yourself. That's okay. So how do they divide up the world? Christians and Jews divide up the world in one way. There's good and there is evil. But these guys don't do that. They say there are people who are victims and there are people who cause them to be victims. So if you're a victim and you do evil, it doesn't matter. You're still a victim. That's why they're out on the streets supporting Hamas, even though they raped and beheaded and did all these awful things. And even though they're pro-feminist, as you said before, but that's okay. You can rape a woman as long as it's a Jewish woman.
Then it's justified.
Exactly. So we've got a problem with the left and the de-Christianization of this country and of the West in general. I spoke last Friday night after the events of last week with those the male and the female nurse.
Mm-hmm.
And I simply reflected. I spoke very briefly because there was a bat mitzvah. I didn't want to take away from the simcha, but I just wanted everybody to know. I said, as it happened 6 years ago, this very week, so we're talking about February 13th, 14th, 2019, I've been a very healthy person through my life until Friday night before that. And without going into details, I ended up in hospital, and I unfortunately had a tumor, a cancerous tumor on my kidney. So I had to have one of my kidneys removed. And not a great thing to happen.
No.
And obviously you don't want the cancer to spread. And here I am 6 years later in good health, Baruch Hashem.
Baruch Hashem. Many more
And
happy,
I simply
years.
turned to everybody. I said, 6 years ago, I was a patient in the hospital system. I said, there wasn't a King of England at that time, but if there would have been, I was treated better. I was treated better than the King of England would have been treated. And after 6 to 8 weeks, I love my sport. I went back and had a game of golf with my non-Jewish golfing partners. And I said to them, first time back, I said, I want to give you some advice. I said, advice number 1, don't be ill. It's not fun. Number 2, but if you are unwell, you are ill, and you have to go into hospital, tell them you're Jewish, because you'll get treated really well.
Really?
And I said that to them.
Wow.
And first of all, half the people in the system treating you are Jewish. Doctors, not the nurses particularly. Yeah. And I said, and number 3, if you want to be treated really well, tell them you're a rabbi. And then you've got that chalk and cheese. So here we've got a situation 6 years later where the last thing that you want to say if you go in, especially out west, is to say that you're Jewish.
Yeah, you don't want to say that.
So I turned around, I told them that. I simply said, look at the difference between 6 years ago and now. I said, however, I want to reflect on something that the Chief Rabbi Jacobovich told me, because I think it has bearing on really your question as well, and I say where some of those attacks are coming from. He was elevated to the House of Lords, and they would vote on all kinds of things. It's Parliament. And one of the resolutions that came forward around about 1980, I guess, was to open up Sunday for Sunday trading so that all the normal shops could be open on a Sunday. Because in England, until then, most shops were closed on a Sunday. Even if you went into a newsagent, you could buy a bar of chocolate, you could buy a packet of cigarettes, you could buy a box of matches, but you couldn't buy a birthday card. They actually covered all that sort of, or you couldn't buy a little bit of sellotape or something like that. It was very restricted. What started happening in the 60s and 70s was cricket, and that started to have Sunday cricket. So by the time it got to about 1980, they brought before Parliament, they wanted to have Sunday trading. And in the House of Lords, you have not only the Chief Rabbi, but you also have, well, he's invited to be there, but by right, you have the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York, the 2 Anglican primates of the United Kingdom. And clearly, they want to keep Sunday as the Lord's Day. It's like us trying to keep Shabbos. So in the vote, Chief Rabbi Jacobovich voted with the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York. So I saw the Chief Rabbi later that week, and I went up to him and I said, Chief Rabbi, can I ask you a question? I said, wouldn't it have been good for us, bearing in mind we can't shop on Shabbos, and Jewish people that need to get something, they've got to run out at lunchtime on a Wednesday or a Thursday, or on the last hour before Shabbos on a Friday. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could go to the shops on Sunday and just be like ordinary people? Why would you vote against that when it's to our advantage to have the shops open on Sunday? And he looked at me, he looked down at me because he was a very tall man, and he looked at me and he said, David, he said, the more Christian this country is, the better it is for the Jews. And those are his words, word for word, that he said to me then. I've never forgotten it. So the first thing, when we see the left and the hard left, they're not Christian anymore.
No, they're definitely not.
You know, we've moved into a secular age, into agnostic, atheistic age, and the Christian values. Yes, there were at times in history that they persecuted us, but we'd gone past that. And now we've just got the best of what Christianity can offer. And now that's being taken away from us. And then, of course, the third, so there's two streams coming at us from either direction. And then you get a third stream in England, in Europe, and certainly here. And that's the Muslim stream. And unfortunately, here in Sydney, we've got quite a radical element. We had an Arab speak in our shul recently from Abu Dhabi. And as he was leaving, he turned to somebody, a friend of mine, and he said quietly to him, he said, be careful, because the people in Western Sydney, he's not talking about every single Muslim, obviously.
No, of course.
But he's talking about, look, at the end of the day, there probably only 25% of Germany were Nazis. But look what happened.
Yeah.
There were only 25% of Italians who were fascists. Look what happened. And there were only about 25% of Japanese who were for the emperor. And look what happened. You don't need 100%. And he said the people out there in the West that he'd met, he said they are more extreme than we have in Abu Dhabi. The problem is, unless, and this is true generally of the West, read Douglas Murray, unless the Western governments wake up and decide to tackle this problem head on in terms of Islamists, extremist elements. I mean, they've brought people in from Afghanistan, from Somalia, from Syria. Have they been checked? Do we know what they think? And then they're still bringing people in. I mean, just to give you an example in numbers, when I came to Australia in 1988, there were 100,000 Jews in this country, more or less. And there were 100,000 Muslims. Now, there are still 100,000 Jews, more or less, and there's about 500,000, maybe more, Muslims.
Wow.
And we don't know, but we sort of feel as if there are elements there that are rabidly well, we know they're anti-Israel, but as per what we saw on TV last week, anti-Semitic. There's another issue. Not only if the Labour Party get back in, maybe they'll bring more in as immigrants, but there's another element, and that is the birth rate. So at the current birth rate in Australia, you need to have 2.1 children per woman to reproduce your society. So there is no country in the Western world, except one, in the sort of developed world, that has 2.1 or more. And that country, by the way, is the state of Israel. Israel's the only country. We love children. So, Baruch Hashem, Jewish women in Israel are having more than 2 point whatever it is. The current figures here in Australia, as per the last census, 1.6, what I call Anglo-Australians. It's not about colour, and it's not about ethnicity. This is about religion or no religion. So the Anglo-Australian, if that means anything to people, we're talking about 1.6 child born per woman. Jewish Australians, but we're very small, we're about 2.1, 2.2. Islamic Australians, over 3. So when you ask me that question, which I haven't answered, because I can't really answer it because I'm not a prophet, I would say that in the next 10 years, 20 years, 25 years, not a lot's going to change as far as I'm aware. It may get worse if we get a liberal government and we get 2 or 3, and if things settle down in the Middle East, maybe things will plateau out. Maybe it'll get a little bit better. But if you say to me 75 years or 100 years, which obviously I'm not going to be here, but my grandchildren or great-grandchildren, if they stay on, it may be impossible. Maybe impossible, not just for Jews. It might in the end be impossible for Christians. I mean, they're predicting already that some of the countries in northwestern Europe, in 50 years' time, I read somewhere Germany in 50 years' time. It's almost
very, very scary,
unbelievable to think that countries that have been Christian for 1,000 years or maybe longer, that within a short space of time might no longer be Christian countries. I mean, at the moment, just take Britain, for example, just as a silly example. People sometimes criticize Israel because it's Jewish. I say, well, I lived in England. I was very happy. It was Christian. I wasn't allowed to be the head of state. I would have loved to have been the King of England. I love giving orders. So why can't I be the king? But I'm not Church of England.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to be Church of England. Not only you have to be Church, I don't think you're allowed to marry a Catholic. So that's the rule in England. What happens in England, if it would happen, I'm not saying it is, but what would happen if in, say, 100 years' time, the majority of people living in the United Kingdom were Muslim? Could you imagine that the ruling monarch would still be Church of England? So how the world is going to change, that hasn't changed for 1,000 years. So you're asking me, is there a future for Jews in Galut? I don't know. Is there a future for Jews in Australia? I think at the moment, yes. But if you say to me, are you personally thinking about going to Israel? The answer is yes, definitely.
And I think even the fact that we're having the discussion of if Labour wins or Liberal, the fact that we have to even have that discussion, to me, is already an indicator that there is no real future for Australian
Well, in
Jewry.
the short term, of course, it would be wonderful for the Jewish community to see a liberal government that is allied with Israel, because it understands what's going on. That would be wonderful. But if you follow Australian politics, John Howard was the most successful liberal politician in our lifetime. I mean, Menzies was very successful, but in recent years, how many elections did he win? I think he won 3. I might be wrong, but I think he won 3. Most people win 2. So even if Dutton gets in, and even if he gets in one more time, well, then the next time Labour are going to get in. And if the current pattern of this sort of attitude of the left going further left than what we see in academia, and again, when we see these two people talking about, oh, you know, how wonderful it was, I was able to kill a couple of Israelis, or what a shame, you know, you're all going to go to Gehenna, which is whatever they said in Arabic, same word, Gehenna. But this is possibly, I don't know, research has to be done, but it could well be the tip of the iceberg. What about the people in the civil service who hold those views? What about people who've infiltrated the police who hold those views? What about people in Parliament? And we certainly got one of them. I wrote to her myself, the woman from Western Australia, Peyton, and she accused Israel of genocide. And I actually wrote to her, and I simply included a very short letter, and I said, perhaps you could explain. And I said, you talk about genocide in the Middle East. I want to agree with you 100%. I said, but unfortunately, you got the wrong side. And I sent an extract of the Hamas charter, which calls for the death of every Jew in the world. So I said, that is genocide. Of course, she never wrote back to me. So how far have these people with these views infiltrated into prime positions, as I say, in the police, in academia, in civil service, and as we say, in the health service?
And the future. All you have to do is walk around a university campus. All those students, they are the future. They are the future leaders of Australia. It's a very frightening thought. If I didn't believe in God, I mean, firstly, thank God we have Eretz Yisrael. Of course, Medinat Yisrael, it's not perfect, and it's not the Mashiach times. We don't have the Beis Hamikdash. But yeah, when I think about the future, I also think of making Aliyah, because I don't trust the world that we live in today.
I think, look, summed up by my 16-year-old grandson, he never had a gap year because he went straight from school to homeschooling, did 1 year at TAFE, and then he's already at university. He's just finished year 1 at university, and he started year 2. He's 17 next week. So he's never had a gap year. And he said to his mum and dad about a couple of months ago, he said, look, when I've done the 3rd year, so kind of mathematics degree at university, when I finish that, I plan to go to maybe to Gush, if he can get in, I'm sure he will, spend a year studying in yeshiva. And then he looked at his mum and dad and he said, and then I'll just stay there. Not staying in yeshiva, but he got, excuse me, I'll stay in Israel. He said, why would I want to come back here when I can be safe in Israel? And I told our state MP, Kelly Sloan, who's a liberal, I told her that. And I know she's told a lot of people, because I'll quote another rabbi. I was really impressed with him.
And we'll end on this.
And I'll end on this. He's Rabbi Dan Lieberman. He's a young man. He's the rabbi in the Perth Hebrew congregation. And I was there during the summer break, and I went there, and he spoke, gave a drosha, and he said, amongst other things, he said, look, I hope things settle down. He'd just come back from Israel himself. He'd been in Israel for the holidays, and this was his first Shabbos back. And he goes, I hope things settle down, obviously, particularly in Melbourne and in Sydney. He said, but if they don't? He just went like that to his kehillah. He goes, but if they don't, what will we do? We'll do what we've always done. We'll move. And who will be the loser? And I thought, for a young man, that was such an insightful thing to say, because the loser, and that's what Kelly Sloan understood, that they're this brilliant young man, 16 years old, doing actuarial studies at university, and he wants to leave this country. That's a brain drain. And they can't afford to lose people like my grandson. But he's saying, why would I want to live here when I can be safe there? And that's what Dan Liebman said. When things turn difficult, what do Jews always do? They leave. And in fact, if you read a book like Jews, God and History by Max Dimon, he makes it very clear. Jews flourish where they are allowed to flourish. And in countries where they can't, they just move on. And that's our history.
Wow. Rabbi Freedman, I feel like we ended up somewhat somber, but also the reality. It's the reality that we're living in today.
Well, we're watching. We read every day the newspaper. We read the polls. We look at what's happening in Israel. We look at on TV. Sure, we're aware.
And we pray, and we believe, because we're believers, the son of believers. And thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom and insights and historical. I feel like everyone just got a little history lesson. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.